The Earth was struck by a meteor. All of humanity has been driven to extinction. Well, all but 30-ish young adults who were preserved in cryogenic sleep and revived centuries later. And so, these sole survivors have to navigate an alien environment and figure out how to live on as the last remnants of the human race. That's the basic premise of Yumi Tamura's Seven Seeds, a post-apocalyptic survival manga in 36 volumes. Seven Seeds is a story that examines the position of humanity within the post-human ecosystem. And with that, this manga also comments on our relationship with the natural world in the present day. What I want to discuss here is how Seven Seeds brings together its plot, its world building, and character writing into one sustained environmental narrative, and the messages it communicates in the process. Hello, my name is Sean, and I break down what makes great stories tick. For this video, I'll first discuss some of the overarching ideas about the relationship between humans and their environment in Seven Seeds. Then, I'll do a deep dive on the story of one of its main characters, the wolf child Aramaki. And finally, I'll bring together all the threads up to this point as I take another look at the series finale. Seven Seeds is a story where everything constantly feeds into each other, and I'll try my best to do this intricate web of ideas justice. Now, I don't want to bog this video down too much with a ton of plot and character exposition, but I do have to briefly touch on its team composition. The survivors of the Seven Seeds Project, a program orchestrated by the Japanese government, are divided into 5 teams of 8 young adults, each of which is named after a season. There's Team Spring, Team Autumn, Winter, as well as Team Summer A and Summer B. These teams wake up at different times and in different parts of Japan. And throughout this series, we jump between groups as they explore their new environment and eventually meet and come into conflict with each other. What's striking about the very start of the series is that the characters seem to arrive in a dangerous, hostile world where everything is out to kill them. The natural world has evolved beyond recognition, and all the familiar animal species seem to have disappeared from the face of the earth. All this is hammered home through the series' first POV change. We get this really marked transition from the clueless and bumbling Team Summer B to the much more overtly competent Team Spring. And yet, this second team doesn't get off the hook any easier. Where Team Summer B is assailed by leeches, Team Spring has to fend off life-sized mantises. And what's more, they have to risk life and limb just to reach potable water. All this serves to communicate the first experiences of the survivors, that their new environment is out to kill them, and gathering just the basic necessities will put them in mortal peril. And all this is combined with an acute sense of loss. The survivors have to grapple with the death of their loved ones and the disappearance of all that was once familiar to them. Their hometowns have been reduced to ruins or completely disappeared from the face of the earth. They've lost everything that gave them purpose in life, and some of them struggle to find a reason to keep living on. There's this one scene where Hana, who's one of the members of Team Spring, is overcome by despair and allows herself to fall down a cliff. But then she lands in a hot spring, and just like that, she realizes how foolish she was to succumb to her grief. It's hard to overstate just how significant this discovery truly is for the morale of Hana's entire team. These hot springs carry tremendous symbolic significance. After all, open-air bathing is a quintessential element of Japanese culture. So, this tiny spring represents a trace of the familiar in an alien world. And more than that, it suggests that nature and culture are not as opposed as they might first have seemed. In actuality, Hana's culture has been shaped by centuries of interactions between the Japanese archipelago and its human inhabitants. And that environment is still here. In other words, this world of ruins is still home. This is the moment with which the prologue of Seven Seeds effectively ends. From here onwards, we see the first steps to rebuild civilization, the first efforts to transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers to a sedentary society. We get to witness this shift during the first meeting between two teams in the series. One point in their journey, members of Team Summer B stumble upon Team Autumn. As it turns out, Team Autumn was awoken from their slumber around 3 years earlier than Team Summer B. And the difference between these two groups is telling. The newcomers can only marvel at the sight of houses and farmlands, at the entire village that Team Autumn has constructed out of thin air. And yet, there's a massive paradox in the depiction of Team Autumn. These people may offer the series' first attempt at rebuilding human society, but nevertheless, their time in the wilderness has made them markedly more barbaric than the unsullied Team Summer B. What becomes apparent soon enough is that Team Autumn only offers a semblance of order, one that is grafted on drugs and violence. And all this is anticipated the moment we set foot in the rotten, twisted world of Team Autumn. The entrance to their village is a gate within a massive wooden wall, a construction that separates the realm of humans from the world beyond. And at this threshold, we see two totems guarding the entrance, a telling sign that Team Autumn has, in a way, relapsed from modernity to a more primitive state. But even more significantly, we spot two torches. And just keep in mind that fire carries major significance throughout Seven Seeds. Time and again, fire serves as a symbol for both humanity as opposed to nature, as well as for unbridled chaos and destruction. So, with this fire perpetually burning in front of their walled garden, Team Autumn is isolating itself from the natural world. And these efforts also extend to the society within the walls. For the members of Team Autumn, sex is entirely prohibited. With this, they're essentially attempting to remove themselves from the cycle of life altogether. But as becomes clear very soon, their efforts to isolate themselves from the natural world breed only violence, paranoia, and despair. And what's more, their efforts don't bear fruit in the long term either. Soon enough, their ostensibly mighty village is reduced to rubble by a shower of volcanic ash, and its inhabitants are forced to wander the lands once more. The futility of human endeavors in the face of Mother Nature is a recurring theme throughout Seven Seeds. The series' next major settlement is even more impressive than the last, and yet it's burnt to a crisp by a forest fire in no time at all. And even at the very end of the series, the survivors' settlement is almost swept away by a flood. In this terrifying world, even the greatest feats of human ingenuity cannot resist the sheer force of nature, which is honestly not all that different from the lessons that the present-day climate crisis is teaching us as well. In Seven Seeds, it's constantly the human beings who have to adjust to their new environment, not vice versa. And yet, all these threats are nothing in comparison with those posed by the remnants of human dwellings. For a story in which humanity has been utterly annihilated, the survivors spend a remarkable amount of time navigating the ruins of the past. 3 of the series' major story arcs involve the survivors stumbling upon the remains of shelters that had been designed to help humanity weather the apocalypse. But each of these failed to preserve their inhabitants for the long term. And more than that, they also threaten to trap and kill those foolish enough to set foot inside centuries later. In every case, the greatest hazards within are created through human interference in the ecosystem. All this was most elaborately demonstrated by the Ryugu shelter, which was designed to harbor 5,000 people during the apocalypse. Everything about this shelter was designed to sustain a human population as efficiently as possible. Those in charge of the project took great care to cater not just to its inhabitants' physical needs, but also the psychological aspects of the process. The Ryugu shelter is really the peak of human resourcefulness. It's humanity's best shot at withstanding every cataclysmic disaster that nature throws at them, from the meteor strike to tsunamis and earthquakes. Rather, the demise of this shelter is caused by a chain of human mistakes that gradually spiral further and further out of control. Its inhabitants first lose access to their storehouse, which forces them to kill off half the survivors as the food stocks run dry. This in turn sparks the chilling decision to recycle the deceased's corpses as fertilizer. At first, this may seem like the most rational course of action. After all, resources are tight in an underground shelter, and they need to do everything in their power to survive. But, as it turns out, this decision would soon seal the entire shelter's fate. The one thing that the Ryugu's leadership had not reckoned with was that their macabre allocation of resources in a closed-off environment would give rise to a new species of parasites. A parasite that first infested the shelter's livestock, and then the human inhabitants. And so, the entire population of the shelter is eradicated in no time at all. And centuries later, the parasites still lie in waiting, ready to infest any survivors foolish enough to open its vault. In other words, the Ryugu's inhabitants fell victim to their own attempts to optimize their chance of survival. They tried to hack nature to become virtual masters of life and death, and almost drove their entire species to extinction in the process. Ryugu's shelter is a tale of human hubris. It was an attempt to create an artificial, self-sustaining ecosystem in the face of an apocalyptic event that would change the Earth's ecosystem forever. And so, its disastrous fate proves that no amount of human ingenuity could ever control the forces of nature. And when the survivors from the Seven Seeds Project explore it centuries later, its ostensibly impressive structures crumble to dust at the slightest touch. Yet, this is not the only lesson that Hana and her allies take away from their visit to the Ryugu shelter. Once they tread beyond its haunting hallways, they discover a world teeming with life. The Ryugu shelter has allowed beings from the past to weather the apocalypse. The survivors just aren't human. The basement of the shelter has been transformed into a thriving ecosystem, a secluded mangrove where Japan's former wildlife lives on to this very day. The other two shelters tell similar stories. I talked about the second one at length in my Ango video, so I'll keep it brief here. At one point, Team Summer B stumbles upon a tanker littered with weapons. This too housed humans during the apocalypse, but unlike the Ryugu shelter, the tanker was armed to the teeth. This turned out to be another massive miscalculation, as the presence of weapons soon led to infighting among the crew. All this strife gave rise to a new species of bacteria with a hunger for blood and steel. And these bacteria soon set their sights on the survivors of the Seven Seeds Project. Here too, the natural process of evolution leads to horrifying results when it takes place in man-made environments. And finally, we get the shelter on the island of Sado, in the manga's last story arc. The ambitions of the Sado project far exceed even those of the Ryugu shelter. The scientists in charge of Sado wanted to create nothing less than a modern-day Noah's Ark. Sado was designed as a repository, storing genetic material from all kinds of plants and animals, with the purpose of completely restoring the Japanese ecosystem from before the apocalypse. The man at its head describes his mission with almost religious fervor. They're the beacon of hope for the Japanese people, the promise that even the greatest disaster in human history can be made undone by the power of science. If, by this point, you've caught on to the message Seven Seeds is consistently communicating, you'll not be surprised that this project failed because of human errors as well. One of the staff members decided to feed their energy bars to a colony of ants. The ants then grew to unnatural sizes, escaped, and soon carved out a space for themselves in Sado's ecosystem. They end up forging a symbiotic relationship with a species of spiders that produce hallucinogenic eggs. And these eggs in turn affect the island's human population. But as turns out, these eggs allow people to enter a blissful, dreamlike state. And for a population of scientists who are trapped alone in a shelter that's gradually sinking into the ocean, this actually didn't seem like such a bad prospect. And so, the vast majority of the shelter's inhabitants actually opted for eternal slumber. In other words, these eggs were both their salvation and their downfall. There's an incredibly poetic irony to this tale. In the end, the masterminds behind the project to resurrect Japan from the ashes are revealed to be nothing more than idle dreamers. people who would rather elect a pleasant illusion than face the reality that their efforts would bear no fruits. But nevertheless, just as at the Ryugu shelter, wildlife flourishes on the island of Sado. Countless centuries have passed, and all the animals and plants that had been brought here are still alive and kicking. The island is a time capsule to a world that is all but lost and forgotten. And more than that, it's a realm of extraordinary beauty. The end of the story, Sado is the promised land for the survivors of the Seven Seeds Project. Here, they've arrived at a paradise where they can finally live in harmony rather than in perpetual conflict with nature. And this is something I'll get back to towards the end of the video. In any case, it's quite interesting that Seven Seeds provides glimpses at these other projects at some of the story's most critical junctures. All these failed attempts to weather the apocalypse offer valuable and remarkably consistent lessons to the survivors from the Seven Seeds program. Time and again, their predecessors' deaths prove that human actions can have a massive impact on their environment, but also that this impact is often not what they set out to achieve. Even seemingly inconsequential decisions can cause enormous ripples, whereas maintaining a healthy ecosystem proves to be an intricate balancing act. Now, up to this point, I have mainly been talking about humans and the natural world as two opposed forces. In actuality, however, Seven Seeds oftentimes makes the distinction between these two categories a lot blurrier. This is exemplified quite well with Hana's Hot Springs, but also, of course, by the new life forms that come into being in these human environments. Natural processes continue to take place even in the most unnatural of spaces. But within this series, there's one character in particular who represents the fault line between nature and culture. I'm talking about my personal favorite among the cast, Takahiro Aramaki, who in many ways serves as the main vehicle to explore these tensions. Before he was sent to the future, Aramaki was a famous high school baseball star. And while he's far from the only athletic character in the series, there's one factor that distinguishes him from most of the other action heroes in the series. The sports training of characters like Arashi, Hana, and Ango translate directly to their new environment. They're exceptional swimmers, mountain climbers, or all-round athletes. Baseball, however, is an entirely different beast. All sports abound with artificial rules and limitations. They're games that only make sense within a very specific cultural context. So now, a teenager whose entire life has revolved around baseball finds himself in a world where his reason to live, his raison d'être, has been ripped away from him. Unfortunately, he doesn't get a lot of time to think. Soon after waking up, his team Winter is attacked by a tiger. And right then, Aramaki puts his baseball skills to good use. He and his teammate Fubuki kill off their assailant by knocking a rock at it, baseball style. This moment seems to represent the victory of culture over nature. The brutish beast vanquished by the combination of rudimentary tools and extraordinary technical prowess. Not much later, they discover a dog that had been targeted by the tiger as well, and Aramaki nurses it back to health. Aramaki's peace is short-lived, however. In due course, the tiger returns with a vengeance. It mauls Fubuki to death and sets its sights on Aramaki thereafter. But then, Aramaki is rescued by an unlikely ally. It's the dog that he had befriended at the start of his journey. Aramaki eventually ends up as the sole survivor of Team Winter. His only companions are the dogs he's befriended, and together they traverse the wilderness for 15 long years. You see, Aramaki's team had been woken up years before all the others. So for over 10 years, he was the only human being in all of Japan. With this backstory, Aramaki occupies a curious position in the fabric of Seven Seeds, where his original victory over the tiger seemed to place the baseball player at the apex of the natural world. The same creature has the last laugh by essentially bringing him down to the level of a beast. Unlike Team Autumn and Team Summer A, which soon established permanent settlements, the lone survivor from Team Winter roams the land with his pack of hounds until he meets the other survivors. With that, the series raises the question if Aramaki's tale is one of a human domesticating wild animals, or of a man reverting to a more animalistic state. The present-day Aramaki, tellingly, even displays a sort of animal senses that he's developed over the years. This transition from human to animal is also facilitated by Aramaki's decision to name his two dogs after his deceased companions. There are certain points where Seven Seeds even blurs the line between the original Fubuki and Mitsuru and their canine counterparts. Moreover, these dogs also take over the literal places of Aramaki's former human companions. Earlier in the story, the manga showcases the close bonds between the Team Winter trio by showing them cuddled up together at night. But once Fubuki and Mitsuru are no more, Aramaki snuggles up to his dogs instead. So in short, what makes Aramaki so fascinating within Seven Seeds' examination of human nature is the way he oscillates between two identities. Aramaki, the baseball star, the cultural hero, and Aramaki, the man raised by wolves. The manga uses him as a yardstick of sorts to gauge the humanity of its other characters. With that, I want to examine the greatest moment of conflict in the entire series. At this point, the members of Team Spring, Team Autumn, Team Summer A, as well as Aramaki have banded together. Yet, this situation has been fraught with tension from the start. Ango, who's effectively the leader of Team Summer A, has been deeply traumatized by a harrowing selection process. And so, he's established total dominance over the other survivors through violence and abuse. I'm glossing over a lot of details here, but I've got a full video on Ango that you can check out later. In any case, Ango's tyrannical reign eventually leads him to attempt sexual violence and become complicit in what seems to be the death of Hana. Now, over the course of this storyline, Ango and his allies are repeatedly likened to beasts. For one, this is an apt metaphor for the threat they represent to the other survivors. In fact, it's exactly Aramaki who first disparages them for drawing their guns during interpersonal conflicts. He speaks from experience when he notes that humans are distinct from wild animals in that they can talk out their differences. But at the same time, this metaphor also reflects the tragic reality behind Team Summer A's selection process. As Ango puts it, their classmates who were deemed unworthy to be sent to the future were slaughtered like cattle. In other words, these are people who were never treated like human beings. And so, it's no wonder that they're struggling to develop healthy relationships with their fellow survivors. But all this is, of course, no excuse for their behavior. And once everything that has transpired comes out into the open, it's Aramaki who once again confronts Ango and his friend Ryo. This is one of the most brilliant scenes in Seven Seeds. That's because this conflict is about more than just the events that have transpired. On a more fundamental level, this is a clash about the essence of human nature. It's about who is the man here and who the beast. So when Aramaki and Ango come to blows, there's a striking difference between the two parties. Ango carries a gun and a knife, whereas Aramaki fights with rocks and his bare hands. In other words, Ango brandishes the tools of scientific progress, and Aramaki carries only the most primitive of weapons. From Aramaki's perspective, their access to firearms has effectively dehumanized the members of Team Summer A. Their guns have transformed them into savages who have forgotten the value of human life. But Ryo espouses the exact opposite view. For him, humans are distinct from other animals because of their cunning, because of their ability to scheme and deceive. So to put it differently, their use of guns is the greatest reflection of humanity's capacity to think, to invent, to overcome the forces of nature. And yet, Ango falls short. All the tools of mankind are no match for the raw physicality of a man who has lived like a beast for 15 years. But while Aramaki comes out on top, he too walks out as a broken man. His confidence in humanity has shattered. He's witnessed the darkest parts of the human condition, and decides that he'd rather live like an animal henceforth. But right after the brawl concludes, we get a third perspective on human nature. That humans differ from animals in that they can establish law and order. Ango and Ryo are not killed. They're tried for their crimes and sentenced to exile. And with that, the community transitions from a reign of violence to the rule of law. Nevertheless, this tragedy prompts Aramaki to leave the human settlement behind. He realizes that there's no place for him in this community. After all, he too resorted to violence to resolve the issue in the very end. In other words, he too failed the test to talk out his differences like a proper human being. And here we get the poignant twist at the end of the conflict. Aramaki has come to believe that he can only preserve his humanity by living among the beasts. So with this, I've reached the Awakening Insects arc, which is easily the most thought-provoking exploration of humanity's impact on the natural world in the entire series. The arc is told from two perspectives. That of Hana, who has been separated from the rest of her teammates, and that of Aramaki, who is traveling through the wilderness in search of Hana. It's a compelling storyline filled to the brim with ideas, images, and associations. This arc starts with what is by far the strangest chapter in all of Seven Seeds. Hana is swept ashore and wakes up in this chibi-like form. From here, she sets out to explore her surroundings, but in a way that we've never seen in the series. Hana is absorbing this new world with a pure, childlike sense of wonder. She even gets adopted by a family of... well, what are they even? Pigs? Capybaras? I don't think it matters. What matters is that she's now becoming basically the new Aramaki, a lone wanderer in the wilderness, befriending the local animals in place of her fellow humans. Right here, Hana starts looking at the world with a fresh pair of eyes. This is no longer a place with danger lurking around every corner, but a realm of extraordinary beauty. With this realization, she's finally ready to live on in this new world in earnest. And as if nature itself responds to her moment of growth, she's allowed to witness the most magical sight in the series. A herd of translucent horses prancing on the seashore. They're almost unicorn-like creatures that seemingly only reveal themselves to those pure of heart. But one night, Hana spots the blazing glow of torches, a beacon of light heralding the advent of other humans. Hana follows the sign, and then we get this tearful reunion with her friends from Team Spring. Hana bawls her eyes out, thanking Fujiko and Chisa for lighting the torches and showing her that she's not alone in the wild. But I want to draw your attention to the panels where Hana first spotted the fire. The torches aren't a warm, comforting kindle. They loom menacing in the darkness, like an army threatening to burn this entire land to the ground. And when Hana climbs up, the first shot of her fellow humans gives off a sense of terror. Their faces are darkened, and Chisa brandishes her torch like a weapon. And then there's this blazing glow in the background. But then the camera zooms in, and the darkness dissipates as if it's fading away through the light of the fire. And we're shown the faces of Fujiko and Chisa. The three women collapse on the ground, laughing and crying, the torch reduced to a harmless, smoldering ember. And in the dead of night, the world has been lit up. Right here, the artwork shows us Hana's transformation in real time. The perspective shifts from Hana the beast, to whom fire and humans represent an existential threat, to Hana the woman, as she is reintegrated into a human community. But while Hana's reunion with her friends is one of the most heartfelt, touching moments in the series, her return to the world of humans also marks a death of innocence. The next day, Chisa serves slabs of tender meat for breakfast. Then, Hana turns to her animal friends, and she notices that they're cowering back in fear, and that one of them has gone missing. That's when she realizes the horrifying truth. She's devoured her former friends, the creatures that had adopted her and nurtured her. And the reason why Chisa was able to catch an easy prey was because Hana had tamed formerly wild animals. With this, she's crossed a point of no return. The childlike Hana is dead, and she'll never more live among the animals. Now, she must play the part of a human and consume her friend's flesh without remorse. We get this absolutely blood-curdling panel of Hana falling down to the black earth with spears of grass stabbing into her. Now that she has transitioned to the world of fire and light, it's as if she's being rejected by nature itself. All this communicated by this harsh juxtaposition between light and dark. From here, Hana vows to study this world, to learn what she can eat and how she can use nature's bounty for her own survival. Gone are the days of play and wonder. Now that she's regained her humanity, she once again acts like an outsider, gazing into a foreign realm. Remember the horse from earlier? The one that represented the magical qualities of the natural world? Now there's talk of domesticating them, of reducing the marvelous to beasts of burden. But more than that, this transition marks the moment where the manga once more focuses on the hostile relationship between humans and their environments, but now on a grander scale than ever before. But first, let's check in with Aramaki. Right now, he's traveling through the wilderness together with Ayu, a girl from Team Summer A, and they're about to have one of the most important conversations in the entire series. At one point, Ayu notices that Aramaki sure seems to have a lot of dogs by now. Indeed, his pack has grown tremendously over the years. And more than that, they've been thriving since Aramaki brought them from their native Hokkaido to Japan's main island of Honshu. In other words, Ayu is the first to observe that Aramaki introduced a foreign predator that may well have an irreversible impact on the local ecosystem. Ayu's view is in fact corroborated a few chapters later. The meeting between Aramaki and Hana is anticipated by Aramaki's dogs harassing Hana's foal. We're shown this invasive species hounding the local wildlife. And more than that, they're targeting the animals that originally represented the undefiled beauty of nature. In a way, Ayu's remarks completely reframe our perspective on Aramaki. Up to this point, the manga has suggested that Aramaki had reverted to the status of an animal. But in actuality, his animalistic lifestyle paradoxically affected his environment in a way that only a human could do. But here's the thing, this conversation is about way more than just dogs. During their travels together, Ayu starts developing romantic feelings for Aramaki. So in a way, Ayu's talk about the uncontrolled proliferation of animals may well be prompted by her own animal instincts that are slowly waking up. Not much later, she blurts out that she's considering Aramaki as a potential sexual partner. The sheltered girl from Team Summer A has developed a serious interest in his genetic material. But if a pack of dogs already represents a substantial threat to the Japanese ecosystem, we're led to question how great the impact would be of humans like Ayu and Aramaki reproducing without repercussions. But where the introduction of dogs and humans is more of a long-term problem, the threat of uncontrolled proliferation is brought to the fore by a third invasive species. Hana and her friends stumble upon a supply shelter that was left behind to aid the survivors. Here, they discover a room filled with shiitake mushrooms. As it turns out, this shelter was a depository for seeds and mushrooms left behind for anyone who survived the apocalypse. Unfortunately, most of these supplies didn't stand the test of time. But what the visitors don't realize at this moment is that they've just unleashed a force far beyond their control. Remember how I noted earlier that everything that evolved within human environments is terrifying and deadly? Yeah, that's true here as well. Within mere days, the mushrooms from a shelter have spread their spores into the forest and started sprouting on everything in their vicinity. They're growing on plants, they're growing on animals, and they're causing their hosts to wither away and die. In short, the shiitake is an unknown entity in this post-apocalyptic world, and so it spreads through the environment like a wildfire. What we're being shown is how even a harmless, edible mushroom can pose an existential threat to the entire island of Japan. At the same time, the mushrooms signify much more than that. With the ideas that have been floating around in the storyline so far, the manga suggests that this is just a harbinger of things to come. If mere mushrooms can single-handedly destroy entire ecosystems, what future impact will the return of humanity have for Japan going forwards? But right then, lightning strikes. It's the dry season, and soon the forest catches fire. Hana, Aramaki, and the rest watch from above as the entire landscape is burnt down in the conflagration. All of this seems like a form of poetic justice. It's as if nature itself is rejecting the mushrooms before they spread any further. Right then, Aramaki's dogs surrender themselves to the flames. They too have become infested with mushrooms, and so they've chosen to forfeit their own lives for the sake of their offspring. Aramaki is forced to watch his most loyal companions burn to death before his very eyes. With that, Fubuki and Mitsuru are finally no more. For now, the ecosystem has been saved. The mushroom infestation has been halted. The excess dogs have decreased in number. But at what cost? The natural paradise that Hana had entered at the start of the arc has been scorched to the ground. An environment that has persisted for 1,000 years has been reduced to ash in mere days. What this storyline is really about is the consequences of unleashing forces beyond your control. In a way, the entire arc is like a raging fire. Its chain of events started with Hana spotting her friend's torches and rekindling her connection to humanity, and it ends with the lands being consumed by flames. And as they set off to new horizons, both Aramaki and Hana have realized that they have no place among the animals. Their animal companions have been reduced to dust, and more than that, they now understand that crossing the boundary between human and animal will only lead to further death and destruction. They have effectively been rejected by the Garden of Eden and sentenced to live with their fellow human beings. But at the same time, this story is also about the resilience of nature. In time, the process of natural selection will accommodate dogs and mushrooms. Even the forest fires are in the end natural phenomena to which the plants have learned to adapt. As Ayu notes, the soil will recover, the forest will grow back, and even the mushrooms will adapt to their new environment. The animals, meanwhile, are leaving for greener pastures. They too will survive and return in due course. So with this, the storyline ends on a hopeful note. Humanity will get a second chance, and they'll make it as long as they're willing to learn from their mistakes. So with all this baggage, we enter the story's final arc on the island of Sado, the moment where all the characters, plotlines, and ideas will come to a head. I've already touched on the Sado shelter in the earlier parts of my analysis, But I want to have another look at this part of the story in light of the Awakening Insects arc. There's a striking parallel between these two locations. In the earlier arc, when Hana sets foot in the forest where she will eventually reunite with her friends, she sets foot in an idyllic landscape with cool breezes and luscious grass. But at second glance, it's also rife with danger lurking under the surface. Nevertheless, when this forest is ultimately overrun by mushrooms and burnt to a crisp, we get the sense that paradise has been lost. Hana's group gets a very similar first impression of Sado. Here too, they bask in the beauty and tranquility of the natural landscape. This island might finally be the perfect place to settle down for good. In a way, Sado offers the group a second glimpse at paradise and another chance to live in balance with nature. But as readers, we know by now that this island is not as peaceful as it first seems. After all, we've already witnessed how the other survivors have fallen prey to hallucinations and become trapped in the caverns of gigantic ants and spiders. It's as if we've gone full circle, back to fighting giant bugs, just like at the very start of the story. But as it turns out, this is not how the events at Sado eventually unfold. Our cast has changed since they first woke up in an unfamiliar world where everything seemed out to kill them. For many of them, the finale is where they resolve their character conflicts and mature in the process. But that's a topic for an entirely different video. In any case, the cast has grown substantially since the start of the story, and this is reflected in the new ways they find to interact with the local wildlife. Some of them discover ways to avoid conflict with the ants that rule over Sado's caverns, and others even manage to befriend them. And as for the spiders, our cast might have to fight them off at certain points, but they also discover that the spiders' threads are a valuable commodity. So by the end of the story, they no longer view the spiders as threats. Rather, they decide to domesticate them, to forge a symbiotic relationship with their former assailants. All this shows how far the survivors have come over the course of the series. They may have stumbled throughout their journey, but at the end, they've learned how to live in harmony with the world around them. Well, that rings true for all but one of them. Among the survivors is a man called Kaname Mozumoto, or Mozu for short. He was the one directly responsible for all the trauma that the members of Team Summer A have incurred. He put them through the ringer and killed off perceived failures without remorse. And even now, he believes that his task is that of an executioner, and he's determined to eliminate Ango for all the harm that he's caused. But by this point, Mozu has in fact become a relic of the past. We see this man falling apart both physically and mentally, and as all the other survivors reject his methods, it becomes apparent that Mozu is the only one who can't seem to adapt and move on. At the end of the story, Mozu alone is unable to forsake violence in favor of peace and harmony, and so he decides to go out in a blaze of glory. He douses himself in oil and lures the ants away from the other survivors, fighting until his last dying breath. But while this is clearly a heroic sacrifice from his perspective, you can't help but wonder if this wasn't futile by this point. After all, the other survivors have long figured out how to avoid outright hostilities with the ants. So by now, the only person to still fight against them is the man who failed to change as he entered the future. And to make this even more poignant, Mozu's death is juxtaposed to one of the most important scenes in the series. There's a long-running storyline around Kurumi, a girl from Team Autumn who had become pregnant. Her situation had been a major source of anxiety for the survivors. How would she fare as the first person to give birth in this unknown world? And during the trip to Sado, the absolute worst-case scenario plays out. Kurumi and her partner Ryusei are isolated from the rest of the group, trapped in a moist, hollow cavern. And right there, the labor pains start. The medical experts in the group can only chime in through the radio. And Ryusei is basically the least reliable lad in the story. But when the moment of truth arrives, Kurumi is prepared for whatever will come her way. After all, she understands that childbirth is the most natural process in the entire world. This is a point that the manga repeatedly highlights. Other animals give birth all the time, and even humans have born children without the help of doctors plenty of times in the past. So why should it be any more difficult for Kurumi? And by the end of the story, she's proven right. Even in the most unfavorable circumstances, Kurumi and Ryusei bring a healthy baby girl into the world. And with that, the story of Team Autumn has basically gone full circle. The team that once erected walls to isolate themselves from the world outside and tried to ban sexual activities altogether is now firmly integrated into the natural cycle of birth and death. But Kurumi giving birth is more than just a single plot point. In a way, it's the climax of the entire story. From the very start of the manga, 7 Seeds has examined how the survivors negotiate their place within this foreign world. The first chapters are characterized by mourning and doubts. The survivors can't tell if there is even a point to living on after losing everything that is dear to them. But little by little, they forge new connections and resolve to build up a new life in earnest. And then, at the very end, this determination to live on is realized through the miracle of birth. Kurumi's child is the first human being to be born into this brand new world. And with that, the human race as a whole is integrated into Japan's new ecosystem. And significantly, this monumental occasion takes place concurrently with Mozu dying in his fight against the ants. This is the moment where the old order that thrived on violence and abuse is succeeded by a new generation, born in a society that is ready to live in harmony with the natural world. But at the same time, the successful birth is also a symbolic representation of the cast's growth as a whole over the course of the story. There's this sense of pure catharsis that sweeps over the survivors as they rise up from the dark tunnels towards their luscious new home. For a long time, they've been wandering aimlessly over a dark path. But after all their pain and suffering, they lifted each other up and stepped out into the light. And so, they emerge from the narrow caverns of the Sado shelter, as if they're being born anew and ready to live on in this beautiful new world. 7 Seeds is a manga like nothing else I've ever experienced. And if I've brought across even half my passion for the series in this video, I feel like I've accomplished what I set out to do. Seven Seeds is a story filled with harrowing events and terrible mistakes, but also one that at its core showcases a deep love for humanity. When I finished reading this manga, I was filled with a sense of hope that we can make things right, even in the here and now. And if you liked what you saw and would like to support me make more videos like this, please do leave a comment or subscribe to this channel. I'm hoping to find enough time to continue working on passion projects like this one going forward, even if they don't have the same level of mainstream appeal as the stuff on my Blue Lock channel. And it's your support and love that really keeps me going. Also, Yumi Tamura's newest manga, Don't Call It Mystery, has finally gotten an English release, so go check it out. I'm still holding out hope for an eventual release of Seven Seeds in the West, hopefully sooner than a time in which the manga takes place. And who knows, good sales for this guy might help out on that front.